Hello and welcome back to Soteriology 101. You probably recognize the gentleman on the screen with me because he has been a guest here at Soteriology 101 several times. Dr. David Allen, welcome back to the program.
Well, Dr. Flowers, it's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for having me back.
Well, it's always insightful when we have you here because we're always learning new things. And I have told people both in front of you and behind your back that you have always been a mentor, someone I've looked up to throughout my years in ministry, and someone in the academic world that I have tried to model myself after, though I'm still striving to be better in the academic world because I've been more in the church and denominational world all my life. And so I admire you so much for your work, and I appreciate you taking the time to come on today to talk about your new book. Before we jump into that, however, for those that don't know, Dr. David Allen serves as a Mid-America's Distinguished Professor of Practical Theology and the Dean of the Adrian Rogers Center for Biblical Teaching. He's also the founder of Preaching Coach. It's preachingcoach.com for those preachers looking for a coach and some help and some resources. This is your man. And so I know a lot of pastors, preachers listen to this program. And so if you've been looking for something to help you to go to the next level with preaching. By the way, David didn't ask me to say any of this. I'm just saying it because I know this is David's bailiwick, and he's really, really good at it. And if you don't know David and you've never heard him preach, you need to. I was so thankful because this last week 2 weeks ago, I went to Salem to preach at a church by invitation on Romans 9. And I was so happy to hear that I did not have to follow David, but in fact he had to follow me because that made it a little bit less pressure on me. But David Allen, love you so much, and thank you again for coming.
Well, thank you, Leighton, so very much. You make me feel old when you make those comments, and I deeply appreciate them. And yes, your reputation precedes you. I followed you there at Salem Heights Church in Salem, Oregon, and you had preached on Romans 9, 1 through 13 the previous Sunday. And then last Sunday, I preached on Romans 9, 14 through 33, through the end of the chapter, and then tried to connect things with chapter 11 as well. And the people loved having you there. You were a great blessing to them.
And I'm sure the same for you as well. And the only regret we had is not bringing more books. The books sold out really quickly, and I wish we had brought some more. But we had a great time there in Salem. The pastor, Justin, and Pete, those guys, man, they're just
it's an amazing work.
Loving, just awesome guys. I was so uplifted by just spending time with them.
Yeah,
getting to know their church, their fellowship is just a wonderful one.
It is.
Today we're talking about something different than what we normally talk about, which I like doing. I like talking about new things, new ideas, new concepts. And this is a book that you released on October 31st, which was no accident because it was formulated, and I thought this was very creative of you, by the way. It was formulated in 95 Theses, which is, of course, All Saints Day, where Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses to the door in Wittenberg. And so you kind of modeled that after this with this book. And so I want to give you an opportunity to introduce it. This is something that you tweeted back in the day. What if Paul wrote Romans 1 through 8 primarily or exclusively to Jewish believers in the Roman churches, and Romans 9 through 16 primarily or exclusively to Gentile believers? Is there any linguistic evidence to support this claim? My new book released on Amazon October 31st, and that is mentioned there again, To the Jew First, Part 2, Romans, a Structural Game Changer. Tell us about this.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to do that. The genesis of this book, or the provenance of this book, is really quite interesting. I had not been particularly studying Romans in depth, but a couple of years ago, a man by the name of Brent Lay, who lives in Tennessee, graduate of Southern Seminary, retired pastor and associate pastor in Southern Baptist life, had been studying this particular aspect, this theory or this idea that possibly the book of Romans was written by Paul, maybe in the first half of the book to Jews exclusively, Jewish believers, and in the second half to Gentile believers exclusively. He contacted me and said, "Hey, we've not met, but I'd like to come by and chat with you." And he did. He brought me a copy of his little book, which was published on Amazon in 2017 on this topic. And he said, David, I want to ask you to consider reading this, and then would you pray about writing on this subject if you are amenable and if you are in agreement that my thesis is at least a valid theory to have out there. Well, to make a long story short, I said, well, let me read your book and then let's go from there. And I read his books, very short, popular volume. It's not attempting to be an academic work by any means, but I felt like that he had some significant linguistic evidence, and I was therefore intrigued and wanted to pursue this further. So I did. I pulled out my Greek New Testament and worked my way through Romans, particularly looking at Paul's pronominal usage in the book of Romans and the antecedents of those pronouns with respect to his audience, to his recipients. Now, what I discovered is what many scholars have discovered and have written on the idea that Paul is addressing both Jews and Gentiles in Romans is not new. That's been around forever. And most scholars who treat the book of Romans in commentaries agree that Paul is writing clearly to both groups, Jewish believers and Gentile believers. The modern approach, scholarly, is that Paul is predominantly writing to the Gentiles, Gentile believers, not to the exclusion, though, of the Jews, but that likely the makeup of Romans was predominantly Gentile believers, but with a number of Jewish believers. So most scholars who write on the book of Romans believe that the audience is twofold. You have Jewish believers and Gentile believers. That is not debated. A second thing, which is not debated, is there are clear sections in Romans when Paul is addressing Jewish believers directly. And there are places in Romans where Paul is addressing clearly Gentile believers directly. That too is not in debate. Now, what is, though, somewhat new is the idea or the thesis, the hypothesis, that what if the linguistic evidence is indicating that perhaps Paul wrote the entire first half of Romans 1 through 8, to Jewish believers, exclusively, or at the very least predominantly. And then what if he's writing the latter half of the book exclusively or predominantly to Gentile believers? And then when you approach that and look at the pronominal usage that you find and the direct address that you find in the first half of Romans and the second half of Romans, you can actually make a very strong case for that. Now, there are a couple of variations of it. One variation is that maybe the introduction to Romans 1 through 17, could be jointly written to Jews and Gentiles. That is the general position probably of most commentators and scholars who write on the book of Romans. But there is some evidence by virtue of what we call ambiguous pronouns and their ambiguous antecedents. You can actually make a case that Paul may be addressing the Jews there as well. And so that the entire 1 through 8 is addressed to a Jewish believing audience, and then 9 through 16 addressed to a Gentile believing audience. And so that is the thrust and the gist of the book, and that's how it came about. So I worked on it, for a little over a year, doing the research and writing, putting it together. And then, as you said, it was published on All Saints' Day, last October 31st. And it's been out. The sales at first were very brisk. They've slowed down, which is very normal, typical for a book, particularly a book on Amazon, and particularly since I'm not a world-renowned author by any means, that would be normal. But it's still selling pretty well. On average, probably now a couple of books a day on Amazon. I would like it to be way more than that, but I'm pleased with what's happening. And I'm looking forward, hopefully, to receiving evaluation of this book by those who are in agreement and those who are in disagreement. I'm hopeful
Well,
that will come in the near future.
well, to give a little background for the listener, Dr. Allen sent me a copy of the book previous to its release,
Yeah,
and gave me a little synopsis and says, "Hey, would you take the time to read this? Possibly write a recommendation." And I'll be honest, when I first saw it, I remembered a little bit of my conversation with Brent Lay on the subject, and I'm not nothing against Brent. I love Brent, but I hear all kinds of just off the wall theories of this kind of idea, that kind of idea, and I just kind of, I don't know if I want to get into this. Especially somebody will send me a book on eschatology or something like that. I'm like, oh, okay, do I want to read this? And how much time
sure.
do I want to get
Yeah,
into this? And all these kinds of things. And there was a part of me that kind of had that reaction just because I didn't. I don't think I realized the importance of kind of what is being said and why it's significant to the theology, which this book doesn't get into theology. This is really just a historical accounting, and the
right,
theology can come later. I think you even
right,
have the plans to get into how
right.
this affects one's theology.
Correct.
But for me, when I first started reading through it, I kind of came to the same conclusion you just mentioned, that the prologue, the first portion of it, kind of seems to be addressing kind of both in general, but then I think verse 18 or so
Right.
and
118.
following, there's most certainly sections of Romans 1 through 8 that are exclusively, he even says they are
Correct.
for the Jewish believer, which to me, when I hear things like that, this is so important to hermeneutics, and I know you get into this as well, because who the audience is really makes a huge difference when it comes to application. But one of the most asinine kinds of comments that I heard was from Dr. James White in debating Jason Breida on this, because he brought up this particular issue. And he makes this kind of audacious, bombastic statement like, oh, I guess 1 through 8 has nothing to do with us then. We just throw it out because it has nothing to do with Gentiles. And these kinds of things. And I'm like going, what? That doesn't make any sense. Knowing who the audience is, even if he's addressing a Jewish audience, doesn't mean there's not application to a Gentile.
Yeah.
Nobody believes that with regard to the sections that are exclusively said to be for Jewish people.
Right.
And so to make that kind of offhanded comment, it seemed just more of a debate kind of a tool than it did to be something that was to be taken seriously as from a scholar. And I wanted you to address that because I want our listener to understand the significance of this. So what, somebody may say, if he I'm more on the line of predominantly versus exclusively. I prefer that terminology because it gives me more wiggle room, and so I prefer the language of predominantly. He seems to be addressing the Jewish people and the Jewish issues within the
Yeah.
first 8 chapters, and predominantly he seems to shift that from 9 on to the Gentiles. And I think you make a very strong case for that, so much so that I was willing to write that endorsement on the back of the book saying that you had convinced me that that was at least the case with regard to the predominant focus. But so what? If somebody asked you, so what? Why did you take the time to do this? How would you respond to them?
Well, first of all, in light of the comments by certain people, you mentioned James White and a few others, the foolishness of that kind of a statement is evidenced by, okay, Paul wrote the book of Philippians to the church at Philippi. Therefore, it's not to us, doesn't have anything to do with us. It's only for the people at Philippi. It just shows I'm sorry, but the stupidity
Yeah.
of that kind of statement, really.
Well, it's the same thing that, even in one of his comments about John 15:16, he rightly acknowledges, when it says you did not choose me, but I chose you, that he's not
Yeah,
talking about unconditional election to salvation, that he's talking about the election of the apostles from among his followers. And
right.
so even James White recognizes that's about apostleship. So therefore, that doesn't have anything to do with us. And with reference to John 6 and other passages where we
Right.
think he's addressing a particular group of people at a particular time and place, doesn't mean there's no application.
Oh,
It
of course
means
not.
it has to be applied correctly based upon who he's talking to, not incorrectly. Because if you have the wrong audience, you're probably going to be trying to answer the wrong question. and you're
Yep.
probably going to get the wrong interpretation.
Right.
That's why in hermeneutics, one of the very first things they tell you to find out is who is the audience, who
Right.
is the author addressing. That's so vital, isn't it?
Oh, it's absolutely vital, which is why there are entire books that are written on the background of each of the books of the Old and New Testament. And one of the key, the six major things you're looking for whenever you are studying a book of the Bible and you're looking at the background, you're obviously going to look at authorship, date, and finally recipients. And then, of course, theme, purpose, and structure. Those six things, at least, you're going to look at in terms of background. Well, one of those six is the recipient, to whom is the author writing. And everyone acknowledges the importance of that hermeneutically for every book of the Bible. Knowing to whom it is written, to what audience it is written, is vital. And then also within a book of the Bible, is an author speaking directly to key groups? And this is, of course, the point about Romans. It's very clear. No one can debate this, by the way. It's clear that there are sections of Romans where the author is addressing Jewish believers. He's overtly, directly addressing Jewish believers. You see that in chapter 2, you see it in 3, and you see it in 4, you see it in 7, and probably other places. And then it's obvious in the book that there are places where the author is addressing Gentile believers. You see that in 9 through 11. You see it explicitly in 11. You see it again explicitly in chapter 15. And also in 14:1 through the middle part of 15, the same thing. And so this is a very important part of biblical interpretation, is looking at the recipients of a book, right? And within the book, within the context of the body of the book, is the author addressing particular groups. Now, by the way, I point out in this book, there's a final chapter here about what about other letters of Paul that would indicate that Paul does this on occasion. And it is very clear in Galatians and in Ephesians. I cite some places in those two books where Paul clearly is addressing Jews, and then he stops or changes, and he's addressing the Gentiles. He even says so. Sometimes he overtly says, I'm speaking to you Jews, or I'm speaking to you Gentiles. At other times, it is the pronominal change where Paul will be writing about we and talking about and to the Jews, and then he will say you. That change occurs, by the way, in Ephesians 1. 3 through 14 is one single sentence in the Greek New Testament. Verses 1 through 12, verses 3 through 12 in that sentence, Paul talks about we, and he's addressing Jewish believers there. And some say he's talking about himself and the apostles, but either way, those are Jews. And then all of a sudden, there's a shift that occurs in 13, and he starts talking about you also. Well, wait a minute. If he's writing to everybody, who are the you also, the shift from the we to the you, it's clear Paul is shifting to talk about Gentiles at that point. So this is not unusual for Paul to do this in either the book of Galatians or the book of Ephesians. And it appears that he is doing it in Romans as well. And so, yes, you're correct. This book is not an attempt to discuss what are the theological implications of this. I have 2 pages where I do discuss the theological implications of Romans 8 and the interpretation of Romans 8:29 and following, and Romans 9, but only a couple of pages. The big issue of this book is what is the evidence linguistically to help us to identify the structure of the book, the overall structure of Romans, and thus, what is the question? As you mentioned a moment ago, if you don't get the right question, you're going to get the wrong answer. Mm-hmm. And so the question in Romans, and again, this is going to irritate some of our listeners, even though Paul addresses individual salvation in the book of Romans, Romans is salvation is by grace through faith, no question about it, but that's not the main purpose of Romans. And even though Paul talks about predestination and election, not until the end of 8, by the way, and 9, but he does talk about it, but it's secondary. It's not the major issue, nor is it answering the question of why is it that some people are saved individually and others are not? Well, the answer is a reformed construct of predestination and election. No, that's not what Paul is about in Romans either. So you've got to get the right question. And the right question clearly relates to the relationship of Jews and Gentiles, Jewish believers and Gentile believers in the church or churches, house churches at Rome. And that is the big thing that Paul is dealing with. And that becomes evident in 9 through 11. And it becomes very clear in 14 and 15. It also becomes clear in 16, where Paul is addressing 26 different names, half of whom are Jewish and half are Gentile. And Paul's big point here is let's get together. Let's get together and respect and love one another and be unified in the body of Christ. And that's really the issue. What's the role of the relationship of Jews and Gentiles? And specifically in 9 through 11, why is it that God's plan of salvation through Israel to bring the Messiah into the world has resulted in the salvation of many Gentiles, but the majority of the nation of Israel has not believed in Christ? That appears to be a problem. Has the word of God failed? Has God not been faithful to his promises? That is the key question of 9 through 11. The key question has nothing to do with individual predestination and election. It's corporate. It has to do with nations. It has to do with believing Gentiles, believing Jews, and what about those non-believing Jews and so forth. This is really the big picture of what's happening in Romans. Now, I don't agree with everything in the New Perspective on Paul. I'm a firm, committed believer to penal substitutionary atonement. I think that's clearly taught in the New Testament. And not everybody in the New Perspective on Paul is as excited about that. But there are aspects of the New Perspective on Paul that are valid insights. And one of those has to do with the recognition that more is happening in the book of Romans than the Lutheran understanding of only justification by faith alone, or the Reformed understanding and paradigm and grid that it's all about unconditional election personally, and this is an explanation of it. And much of recent scholarship, and by recent I mean the last 50 years on Romans, is beginning to make that point.
Yeah, well said. Nathan points out something here in the side chat. He says, ask yourselves why someone would be against the idea that Paul wrote in one part to the Jews and in another part to Gentiles. Why the pushback? What do you think, Dr. Allen? Why is there so much pushback to this concept and idea of predominantly the first portion of it being really addressed to the Jewish people and then a shift to the Gentile people in the second half?
Well, I think there are two reasons for that. One is the so-called the novelty of the idea. Why wasn't this discovered 500 years ago? Or why has no one come up with this until the 21st century? And that is a valid question, by the way, because that does not, or that is a valid question to ask, but it's important to recognize that the novelty of a concept is no guarantee of its falsity. It's also no guarantee necessarily of the truth factor in it as well. The point is, it's either true or false. It doesn't have anything to do with whether it's new or not. Or there are many things that get discovered along the way. There are many things that are believed and taught by people. This is an area that I've spent a lot of time in. So let me use limited atonement. The concept of limited atonement is the new kid on the block. Other than Gottschalk of Orbay, the French monk in the 9th century, you don't have anybody in church history advocating limited atonement until 1586 AD.
Well,
And
even
so
God's chalk
limited
was
atonement
casted
is the
out.
new kid on the block. So yet
Yeah.
my Reformed friends who are 5-point Calvinists are going to argue strenuously. Well, they'll either argue, well, Dr. Allen, your historiography is false. You don't know what you're talking about. In which case, the book, The Extent of the Atonement, by the way, has been out now 8 years, and there's been zero refutation of the history of the book, the historical theology in the book, zero from anybody, Calvinist. Period.
Well,
No,
if the problem is if Calvinists try to refute your claims, they're going to be refuting themselves.
they're going to be refuting themselves, because I quote half the Calvinists who are four-pointers throughout church history who make this very same point. And so, again, I think that's a part of it. I think, secondly, there's been Reformed pushback because I think people think that, oh, my goodness, this is going to undo the golden chain of Romans 8. Well, we don't need this theory to undo that. There are plenty of exegetical reasons why Romans 8, the Reformed interpretation of Romans 8, is not accurate. There are also plenty of good reasons why their interpretation of Romans 9 does not support unconditional election. But this particular approach, I think, will have impact on that, because the point that we discover, if Paul is predominantly writing to Jewish believers, it is very clear that biblical Judaism and Second Temple Judaism have no theology of individual personal election to salvation, and certainly no theology of individual reprobation. And so if Paul is writing to Jewish believers, it is highly unlikely that you would have the anachronistic Reformed concept of unconditional election in chapter 8, and the same goes for chapter 9, verses 1 through 23. That's going to be a problem. Now, I will develop that in this second book, where I'll bring out the theological implications of this. But I suspect that's a fear. This is a way, or this is something that's going to throw a wrench into the Reformed machinery, and they're going to scream bloody murder about it.
Yeah. Well, this is so important, generally speaking, as well, when you're talking about audiences and Paul's tendency to approach things from more of a general corporate perspective. So when the average Westerner hears the word you, or the word, us, these kinds of things, they're thinking about the individual you individually, versus the Texas y'all, use guys from the North, the plural form of the word. And in Eastern Orthodoxy, this debate hardly even exists, because they think in more corporate familial terms than most Westerners tend to do. Right. And so they'll come across, like the passage out of Thessalonica, where he is talking to the church there and saying, I thank God for you. You received our gospel, and he's speaking about, about the Gentile people receiving the Jewish gospel, and thanking God that he's chosen them from the beginning. This has always been God's plan from the beginning, to bring you, the Gentile people, the gospel. Right. And the Calvinist reads that, that means you individually, the individuals that have believed, that means he chose you all, and that's why you're believing. That's just another example of how that, again, the duck and the rabbit thing that we've talked about so many times, that shift in perspective, that when you're looking at it as a Westerner and you're looking at the individual you, me, I, my, the individual, then you read those words into Paul's meaning as if he's talking about individuals being chosen unilaterally before they're ever born, versus the concept and idea that God has chosen to bring the message to the Jews as well as the Gentiles. Correct. And I think those are the kinds of things that come out when you really begin to focus upon the audience, and the fact that Paul is addressing historically. This is when the Jewish peoples are kind of coming back into Rome. And there had been a dispersion of them, and there's conflict between the two groups. Understanding that Paul might have a really good reason for addressing one group and then the other historically. Right. You want to talk any more about that? A lot of people may not be aware of the historicity of what's happening in Rome at that time. Yes, I'd be very happy to do that. And one of the things I do in this book, in the first chapter, is I walk you through, for example, the book of Acts in summary fashion. But one of the things that's true about your Bible that's often missed by people is this constant
focusing in Scripture, in the New Testament, on the role and relationship of Jews to Gentiles. And when you read carefully the book of Acts, and I just walk you through basically Acts 2, moving Acts 2 all the way through the end, Acts 28, and show you the Jewish focus that Luke has in writing Acts. By the way, he has the same focus in writing Luke. You can read more about that in my Lucan authorship of Hebrews, where I argue that Luke himself is Jewish. But I think that when you read what's happening in Acts, it's all about the relationship of national Israel, unbelieving Israel, and their relationship to the apostles, who are Jewish believers, and the early church there in Jerusalem and surrounding areas in Judea are Jewish churches. And then the spread of the gospel includes the Gentiles. But when Paul begins to go to the Gentiles, he doesn't stop going to the Jews. In fact, Acts is fascinating because over and over you read this. Paul will start, he gets to a new city, he's the apostle of the Gentiles, but where does he go first? He goes to the synagogue to preach. He goes to the Jews first. And then when they reject, Paul shakes the dust off of his feet and he says, all right, you reject the gospel, we therefore turn to the Gentiles. But what does Paul do in the very next city? Luke records he goes right back to the synagogue first, and then moves on after they reject, or after he's able to give the gospel to them, and some believe. And by the way, in most places, some Jews do believe. That's what Luke records. There's a believing remnant all the way through the book of Acts. And then basically you've got Paul on his way to Rome, and how does Acts 28 conclude? Well, you've got two groups of Jews, of Jewish believers. You've got a group of Jewish believers that are greeting Paul first there at the port town outside of Rome, roughly 60 to 80 miles outside of Rome. And then the end of Acts. How does Acts end? It ends with Jewish leaders, unbelieving Jewish leaders coming to Paul. He spends the whole day, preaches to them. Some believe and some reject. Paul quotes Isaiah 6, and Acts ends. What you have in Romans dovetails with what you have right there in Acts 28. Romans was written before Paul had been to Rome in AD 57. The events of Acts, Luke probably wrote Luke around AD 61. He probably wrote Acts around AD 63. And the events of Paul, Luke says Paul dwelt 2 whole years in his own hired house. Well, Paul arrived in Rome roughly AD 60 to 61. 2 years would be at the most AD 63. So how many years elapsed from AD 57, the writing of Romans, to Paul's addressing these Jews? 5 years, AD 57 to AD 63. That's only 5 years. Paul is obviously greatly concerned about what is happening in the church at Rome. He is greatly concerned about the Jew-Gentile relationships in the church at Rome. And then when you just look at Acts, and bingo, you look at Romans from there, and bingo, you see how it all dovetails, and that focus continues in the book of Romans. There's a very heavy interest and focus on Paul's part about the Jewish believers and Gentile believers getting along, relating well. And that is, by the way, the predominant interpretation of Romans 14 and 15. The weaker brothers and the stronger brothers are generally the Jewish believers versus the Gentile believers. And so it's clear that this background plays a critical part. So I begin there. I begin in this book with that, the role of the relationship of Jews and Gentiles, first seen in Acts, and then what we see in Romans. And then Paul is concerned about these relationships clearly in Galatians and Ephesians, and maybe some other places, but obviously in Galatians and Ephesians. All of this plays in to the idea now with some linguistic undergirding that maybe Paul is actually taking Romans 1:16, that his gospel is to the Jew first and also to the Greek, mentioned, by the way, 3 times in Romans. That phrase in Romans 1 and 2 is mentioned 3 times. And so it appears that is not only true chronologically, and it is not only true theologically, but I'm arguing that it is true literarily with respect to Romans, that the first half of Romans is written to Jewish believers, and the back half of Romans is written to Gentile believers. Now, here is some of the linguistic evidence. Let me give you the big picture. Linguistic evidence.
Okay.
There is no direct statement in Romans 1 through 8 that Paul is addressing Gentiles as a group. But there are several direct statements that he is addressing Jews. There is no direct statement in Romans 9 through 16 that Paul is addressing Jews. No first person addressed to Jews. But there are several first person addresses to Gentiles in 9 through 16. None to Gentiles in 1 through 8, several in 9 through 16. None to Jews in 9 through 16, several in 1 through 8. I find that very interesting.
And that's something I did not take note of until your book. Honestly, I hadn't even thought through that. And even if one were to argue that it's only the sections where he explicitly says this is for the Jewish people, that only those are exclusively for the Jewish people. What's interesting about that to me, David, and maybe you can speak to this, it doesn't change what we're understanding about the text as far as its application, unless we're misapplying it and trying to answer a question Paul's not answering, obviously,
Exactly.
or we're doing a misinterpretation. What I think your findings are showing us and helping us to keep in mind is what issues Paul is attempting to address, what's in the mind of the author when he's addressing this towards his fellow countrymen.
Right.
Because when he's addressing especially the Judaizers of the day who are trying to turn the Gentiles into Jews by having them circumcised, and that's the battle that's always in the mind of Paul, he is so often confronting his fellow countrymen for what they're doing to the Gentile believers that's the big issue of the day. It's not Calvinism versus Arminianism in Paul's mind. That's not what's going through his mind. It is this Judaizers versus the ingrafting of the Gentile concepts that are going on. And that's ultimately what he's addressing. And the infighting between his own fellow countrymen and these new Gentile believers and their inclusion within the church and what's happening there, that is predominant in the mind of Paul. And when you understand that going into the text, you're not likely to misinterpret the text. You're not near as likely as to misinterpret the text as if you start with a theological premise, i.e. Calvinism versus Arminianism, and you think Paul is addressing Calvinism versus Arminianism, and you walk into a text and you see before the foundation of the world, for example, and you don't put that in the context of what Paul says in Ephesians 3, for example, when he says, this has been God's plan from the very beginning, from the foundation of the world. It has always been God's plan to what? To include the Gentile nations.
Right.
That through you, all the families of the earth will be blessed, he said to Abraham. This has always been his plan. This is not a new idea. This is not a new concept that Paul just made up. Paul is trying to say this has always been the plan of God in election, that he has elected the nation of Israel to be a blessing to the rest of the families of the world. And therefore, the before the foundation of the world or since the foundation of the world kind of commentary is Paul re-emphasizing the plan of God since the foundation of the world, not him picking certain individuals to be destined for heaven and others destined for hell since the foundation of the world or something of that nature.
Absolutely. No question. You're absolutely correct about that. If you do an atomistic reading of Romans, then you don't see the big picture, and you're bringing your grid to the big picture, and that's the problem. By the way, I address this in the introduction to this book. I talk about that and how we all wear glasses. Everybody brings their paradigm to the text of Scripture, and to the best of our ability, we need to step back from that. Obviously, exegesis precedes theology. We don't do it reverse. You don't do theology and then because if you put theology first and then you try to do exegesis, your exegesis is more likely to turn into eisegesis. And that's, of course, what I think happens with the Reformed interpretation, especially of Romans 9. It is very clear. Now, here's what's interesting. All of the Reform that I've been able to read, and I've read a ton of them, all of the Reformed who comment on Romans 9 agree that Romans 9 is clearly corporate. Two nations are in your womb. This is what God himself, told Rebecca when she was on the birthing stool. And so the corporate interpretation is clearly there. What's not there is the addition of the individualistic election and predestination. That's not in Genesis, at least not in focus, beyond the two children. They're individual, yes. But what God says is happening there is corporate, or it's national. Two nations are in your womb. And so all reformed exegetes and theologians agree that Romans 9 is corporate. But what they do is what no one in the early church fathers did until the later Augustine. They also now say, but it's also individualistic. And it has to do with individualistic election, a la Augustine and Calvin and Reformed theology since. And that's the problem. That's the new kid on the block. Nobody in the first 300 years of the early church fathers held that view until the later Augustine. They all affirmed that it was a corporate issue, but they also all affirmed that the election there was not unconditional. In fact, most of them argued prior to the later Augustine that it was based upon foreknowledge. Now, you can make a case for that, but I think there's a better way of even understanding what's happening than just basing it on foreknowledge, which, of course, is strongly Arminian. But also, you have those Arminians who do not base it on foreknowledge. They base it on corporate election. You're much better on more solid ground there in order to do that.
But what's interesting to David is if you read Sproul's commentary, it's interesting how they avoid the word foreknowledge, I think, for implication purposes, but they can't have Esau being condemned for no apparent reason.
Yeah.
They have to have the foresight of sin view for Esau, because they'll
right.
even say, he even said in his commentary, God takes into account the sin of Esau.
Yeah.
And so what's he doing? He's looking through the quarters of time to see the sin of Esau so as to reprobate him or to condemn him on the basis of his sin. But that nullifies the whole before he did anything bad.
Exactly.
Concept.
That is clearly eisegesis, because that is not what the text says. The text says nothing about the personal salvation or reprobation of Jacob or Esau.
Exactly.
Nor does Romans 9 say anything about the personal salvation or reprobation of Pharaoh.
Correct.
In fact, Genesis is very clear what God says to Rebekah. The promise, the decree, and the promise is stated in Genesis. The elder will serve the younger. Well, that's not personal salvation. You have to read into the text to get personal salvation out of that. And of course, the concept of quotation of Malachi, which is 1,400 years later, where Paul shifts from Genesis quoting all the way to Malachi, 1,400 years later, Jacob I've loved, Esau I've hated. All scholars who write on Romans 9, including most Reformed scholars, as well as those Old Testament scholars commenting on Malachi, point out that love-hate concept is a covenant concept. It's covenant love that God says to Israel way down in Malachi. Hey, look, Jacob, I didn't make, with Esau, I didn't make my covenant with him and with his descendants, the Edomites. Oh, no. And they're nasty, sorry dog people. Look at what all the sin they've done. But then, what does God do in Malachi? And you accuse me, God, you're accusing me of not loving you, not being faithful to you. Hey, wait just a minute. You're the ones that have been unfaithful to me. Shall we talk about you for 1,400 years? You constantly rebelled. You constantly went into idolatry. I destroyed the northern kingdom in 722 BC. I sent off the southern kingdom in 586 BC into 70 years of exile, but I did not forget you. I brought you back. And even though you've not walked with me, I have loved you. It has nothing to do with individual reprobation of Esau and individual a covenant relationship with Jacob, it does have to do with that, with Jacob. It's just that Esau is not in God's covenant line. Therefore, and this is shocking, my Calvinist friends are going to be happy when they hear me say this. The election, the choice of Jacob over Esau in Genesis and in Romans is unconditional. Mm-hmm. The problem is it has nothing to do with salvation. Yeah. And so unconditional election to salvation is not taught there. But right. It's very clear before either one did anything good or bad, not based on anything they do, not based on foreseen faith of Jacob or foreseen sin in Esau or whatever. God chose one over the other. And what is the promise? What's the choice? The elder shall serve the younger, not that the elder will be reprobated and that the younger will be personally saved. No, that's not the point. It's not the point in Genesis, not the point in Malachi 1, verses 2 and 3, and it's not the point in Romans chapter 9.
Well, I'm really glad you brought that up. It was a question that was brought up after my sermon in Salem, because I talked about the condemnation or the hatred expressed for Esau or the Edomites, and how it was, like you said, almost 1,500 years after the fact that they were dead and gone, but that the condemnation expressed towards them was conditioned upon the fact that they attacked the Israelites, that it was actually after that. But right. Somebody pointed out afterwards, he said, no, I'm not sure. I thought it was unconditional that he chose one for a service and over the other. I go, oh, yes, you're right. I'm really glad that guy was listening. Because even though it might have been a conditional hatred, in other words, this wrath being put onto the nation of Edom because of their attack, doesn't mean that the choice of one brother over the other brother to carry the seed, to be have the covenant relationship, that they were chosen based upon the morality of the two boys or the nationality of the two boys. Obviously, they're the same nation from the same grandfather. And so Paul is proving that it's not based upon the nationality or the morality, that this brother was chosen over the other for the purpose of this service, of the bringing about the promises of God.
Yeah.
So it makes so much sense once you see it, and it flows so much better with chapter 10 and 11 when you understand it that way versus the individual, double predestination, reprobation concepts that Calvinism enters into it, reads into this text.
Yeah. Now, the issue, by the way, of, again, Jews and Gentiles, and the predominance of Romans 1 through 8 written to Jews, maybe not the exclusivity of it, but the predominance of it is affirmed by many Roman scholars. Now, let me give you a couple of examples. James Dunn, in his works and writings, points this out. He is a Roman scholar, was a Roman scholar. C.E.B. Cranfield, the same thing, points out the fact that this isn't talking about individual predestination and election. It's clearly talking about national election and nations corporately addressed. But even the point is, these men and many others, by the way, point out that the majority of what is said in Romans 1 through 8 is said to Jewish people. Now, in terms of their audience, now they may not say that everything is, but they do say the majority is. I'm building on that. I'm not just creating something out of the wind here, out of the netherworld. I'm building on that, looking at clear places where he's speaking to Jews and wondering, is it possible that he's actually speaking to Jewish believers in all of Romans 1 through 8? And my claim is that it is indeed possible to make that claim. And what I have attempted to do is back it up linguistically in this first book, To the Jew First, two-part Romans. And notice the chapter title has a question mark at the end. So we're not making an assertion. We're saying two-part Romans, a structural game changer.
Yeah.
Is it? Well, let's discuss it. Look at it. Look at what Allen wrote and see if it makes sense. Does he have a legitimate claim? And by the way, I quote dozens and dozens of both Calvinist and non-Calvinist authors and theologians and exegetes on Romans 8 and 9 in this book. And so you before you dismiss it out of hand as a kooky, crazy-brained, harebrained idea, maybe you want to read it first before you make a foolish statement about, well, we've debunked this. There's nothing to this. This is just crazy. You don't even need to read it. That's not it's not a Christian approach, and it's certainly not a scholarly approach to things.
We'll look at one such critique here in a minute, but I wanted to give this feedback from, I think maybe a fellow Calvinist in the side chat that asked this question. His name's David Horvat. He says, "Why even bring up individuals as examples if it doesn't apply to individuals? It makes no sense. When you talk about a child, a promise, that is salvation." How would you reply to David, Dr. Allen, who's asking this question or pushing back maybe?
Individuals are involved in the original choice of Israel. Abraham was an individual, but he was chosen not because he was an individual, although that's the only way you can choose. He is an individual, but he was chosen for the purpose of the nation that would come through him, and that he would bring a seed, singular, an individual into the world that would be the savior of all the world. That would be Jesus. And so it's not that salvation is not a part of this. Nobody's saying that. But the point is that God's choice of Abraham, then his choice of Isaac, and not Abraham's other children. Abraham had 3 wives and 8 children, but only one of the 8, Isaac, is the promise. The promise goes through Isaac.
And I asked this question in Romans 9 debate with James White. I just want to point this out. What about the other sons of Keturah? What about Ishmael? Could they have been saved? And he immediately has to say, well, yeah. I mean, we don't know that they can't be saved. That's the whole point. It's not about Isaac being chosen for salvation and the other brothers not being chosen for salvation. It's about Isaac being chosen to carry the promise and the other brothers not being chosen for that.
Yeah, that's
the point.
Exactly right. And so now you get to Jacob and Esau, and God says, my choice is Jacob. That's an individual. But the purpose of that choice, as God makes clear, you can't argue with God on this. God says 2 nations are in your womb. That's the key to the interpretation. And so it's not Esau. The blessing is going to come through Jacob and his lineage, and then all the way down through the Jewish people, through Judah, all the way down to the Messiah, Jesus. Now you're back to an individual. And yes, salvation, of course, is individual. People aren't saved as groups or in groups. Everybody in the Old and New Testament is individually saved based on their response to God by faith. And so nobody's denying that either. That's a kind of a red herring here in the discussion. The issue is, what is Paul's focus? Moses' focus in Genesis is clearly corporate. Paul's focus in Romans is also clearly corporate.
Yes. Well, and I also point out that the people obviously represent their nations. The Edomites were represented by Esau. Jacob's name was changed to Israel, which obviously represents the nation of Israel. And so there's national representation there. And Pharaoh, this is something that shocks Calvinists. Sometimes I'll ask them, do you think Pharaoh was elected? And they'll go, well, no, he wasn't elected. And I go, what? The Bible says, I chose you for this very purpose.
Right.
So he elected him. So notice I didn't say he's elected to salvation or elected to damnation. Right. I didn't say, I just said, is he elected? Because that makes Calvinists think beyond the concept of if someone's elected, they have to be elected unto salvation. No, you might be elected for a service.
Correct.
Pharaoh was elected to serve the purpose of making God's name known to all of the people of Egypt by each one of those plagues that demonstrated his power over the false Egyptian gods. So God elected Pharaoh.
And pardon me for interrupting, Leighton, but which is what the text says. Let's stay with Scripture. Show me your Hebrew Bible and your Greek New Testament where we're wrong on this. You can't, because it obviously says Pharaoh was chosen for this purpose, and then it explains the purpose. And the purpose is not personal salvation. Whatever God's plan is and was for Pharaoh in terms of personal salvation is not a part of Paul's thinking here, and not a part of what the text addresses.
Yeah, and I often point out, it's very interesting. I think there's a parallel in the way that in the way he hardens Pharaoh in order to bring about the first Passover, in the same way he
Right.
hardens Israel in order to bring about the second Passover. And I think there's a lot of parallel there. And
Right.
again, there's some national representation, obviously, in those corporate representations in those concepts.
Right.
And so,
we don't have to deny what Scripture says. Did God harden Pharaoh's heart? Yes. But is hardening there a cipher for reprobation in terms of individual salvation and reprobation? No.
And once you put those lenses on and you hear the word hardened, and
That's
you
all you
automatically
can
think,
think of.
oh, that's reprobation.
That's all you can see.
The same people who are hardened, folks, the same individuals who are hardened in chapter 9, Paul says have not stumbled beyond recovery. He
Bingo.
says in chapter 11, verse 11, he says that he hopes that his ministry will provoke them to envy so that they too will turn from their ways and be grafted back in and be saved.
Yep.
So that can't be the reprobate of Calvinism, because he would have no hope for them if they
Exactly.
were hardened in the reprobation sense.
That is correct. If unconditional election is true and reprobation is either active or passive, it doesn't matter. Pay your money and take your choice. Then you can't have someone who is originally in the category of the reprobate and the hardened shift into the category of be mercied by God and ultimately be saved. And yet that's precisely what Paul says occurs in Romans chapter 11. And it is the death knell to unconditional election.
Yeah. Well said. Let's go back to your book real quick. And I want to point this out because this was some of the critique that you had in your very first, you tweeted this out back in October when the book was first being released.
Yeah.
Kind of introducing people to it. And one of our favorite Calvinistic interlocutors, Dr. James White.
Oh my goodness.
he replies and he says this: there is nothing that screams, we can't defend Reformed theology more loudly
Can't
than
defeat
this.
it. Yeah.
We can't defeat Reformed theology more loudly than this utterly absurd, already refuted, ahistorical theory. It is the final refuge of those without the ability to engage the text.
Yeah.
What say ye?
Well, poor James, bless his heart. This is sort of the
For those that don't know,
Southerners.
Southerners, when you say "bless his heart," that's
there's meaning behind that.
There's another different meaning behind that than you might go. Sorry, go ahead.
It's difficult. There are so many things wrong with this tweet that it's difficult to know where to begin. Number one, this is not how you treat fellow believers. This, frankly, is an immature kind of an attitude that's expressed here. Can you imagine a scholar on the level of some of the scholars, both Reformed and non-Reformed? Can you imagine a Doug Moo or a Ben Witherington responding this way to somebody's theory? No. You can't.
No, and people need to understand, and people need to understand this. I know Leighton Flowers has debates with James White, and there's all kinds of lobbying here. But David Allen, and again, David, I know I'm not just trying to flatter you because you're the guest on here, but you have published over 4,500 pages of academic materials.
Right.
You're on the level of the Shriners and the Moos out there. I'm not, and so whenever they lob things at me because I'm a denominational worker, but when you're an academic like you are, David, and you have published these kinds of works and have done the academic work in order to get them through credible publishing, for somebody to have this kind of response is just...
Well, it's beyond the pale.
Academics.
Right.
It's
beyond the pale. And it's unchristian. It's spiritually immature. It also makes presumption. You presume that my goal in writing the original book was to defeat Calvinism. Well, I've written plenty of books prior to this book that address scholarly the problems with Calvinism. I don't need another book, and I certainly don't need the book of Romans attempting to understand Paul's structure in Romans as a means of defeating, Calvinism here. So, that's a problem. And notice he talks about that which is utterly absurd. Really? really, all I'm doing is building on the work of a number of scholars, genuine, true scholars, not popular authors, but scholars who have written on the book of Romans, who already point out that large segments of Romans are clearly written to Jewish believers. I'm just saying, is there linguistic evidence to expand that? So the idea that's utterly absurd is, of course, false. Already refuted, only in James's mind has it been refuted. It's not been refuted.
Well,
I'll
I
be
mean,
very happy
he
for him to
obviously
read.
he didn't even have a copy of the book when he writes this. So
He-
how does he refute something he
It's
doesn't?
exactly right. He couldn't have. And so I'd be very happy for him to read the book and refute it step by step, but it's certainly not already refuted. It's also not ahistorical, even though it is new. It is a new theory, that's true, but again, we've already addressed that. And then, of course, to make the statement, the final refuge of those without the ability to engage the text. Now, do you want to say, and I don't want to go too far here, but as you pointed out, I've written 14 books, 4,500 pages of published academic material. And I have in all of my books Calvinists who are friends of mine who affirm that David is approaching this scholarly and in a non-polemical way, and we encourage you to read it, including 5-Point Calvinists who said that about my work. And none of them have said that poor old Allen, he doesn't have the ability to engage the text. I've written 3 commentaries. I have never been accused of having an inability to engage the text ever, except for James White. And so it's just so beyond the pale that it's really sad.
After my years of engaging with Dr. White, I've developed my own internal White to English dictionary. And when he says that somebody doesn't have the ability to engage the text, what he means is they disagree with the way I've engaged the text.
Exactly. Yeah, they disagree with me. And there's an implicit here, even though he would not explicitly affirm this, but there's an implicit, tacit convergence of his interpretation with the authority of the text itself. I mean, hey, I'm just defending the text, James is saying here. That poor old Allen, he's disagreeing with what God says, and it just, again, it's a sad turn of
Plus,
events.
you've taken, as you've mentioned, a very epistemic place of humility in the sense of saying, I'm not dogmatically saying this is absolute. This is more of something we're exploring. You've used the predominantly concept. If it's either predominant or exclusive, and how would that affect how we read the text? Let's consider these things. And anyone who reads scholars from both sides of the aisle have all kinds of these kinds of speculations from different commentators.
Of course they do.
All over the place when you read the scholars. They always make, and again, they're usually humble about it. Most of them don't dogmatically say this is what it is. They'll say something like, many scholars believe that this could be this. Most scholars believe that he's addressing a Jewish audience. Most scholars believe he's in prison when he's writing this. Most scholars,
right.
They're presenting different concepts and ideas in order for the reader to understand where the author may be coming from. And that is done all the time among scholars.
Sure.
And so for Dr. White and others to treat this as, David Allen is just trying to defeat Reformed theology, not willing to engage the text, obviously it's a very short-sighted and rude, frankly, commentary.
That's the other word. I didn't mention that word, but it is rude and it's unseemly. In fact, it's ungodly. It's ungodly. It's an ungodly way of speaking, an unchristian way of speaking. And James should know better. I mean, he should know better. He's letting his emotions get away with him, and he knows better.
Well, the good news for you, though, Dr. Allen, is that when Dr. White says things like that about my books, I sell more of them. And so There you go. There's a silver lining. You'll
Yeah,
probably sell more books now that more people know that
yeah.
Dr. White doesn't like it.
Exactly.
Um,
What I would say is this: buy the book and read it. It's very inexpensive, by the way, on Amazon. Whether you get it, as an actual Kindle version, it's like $8.99. My goodness! And even the print version is only $12.99. It is also available in hardback for those of you like me who like to have a hardback edition of stuff on your shelf for longevity's sake. Uh, but yeah, just read it, and then you can decide. Well, do I agree with James White, or do I agree with David Allen, or maybe I don't agree with either one of them? Maybe James has gone overboard, and maybe David has gone overboard in some of his things, were conclusions. I don't agree with him fully, but I don't think anybody will read it and conclude that what I have said is absurd.
no, they won't. And for those that don't know Dr. Allen as well as I do, and have not seen, he has quite the library. Matter of fact, it may be bigger than the local library here down the street from me, in the Dallas area where I'm at. He's got a huge library. But what's even more impressive, and again, David didn't know I was going to say all this, is that he unlike me, who has a pile of books right over here and another little small bookshelf over there, I've read about 10% of all my books. It seems like maybe a little bit more on some of them.
Yeah.
But Dr. Allen's the type that actually reads all of the books on in his library, and then he can recall them. That's what's amazing to me. I don't know if you remember conversations that we've had over the years, when I came to your office there where you were still at Southwestern.
Yeah.
And we would start talking about something, and you would say, well, yes, so-and-so said this, and you walk over to this long pile of books, and you reach up right where it was. I believe he was here in this book. And I was like, how in the world do you remember all of these things? And I don't know if you have eidetic memory or what it is, but you have an ability you have the ability to pull all of these quotes and remember what's all in those books. But it is quite impressive. And
well, you're very kind about that. I really don't have a photographic memory at all. I do mark in my books, and I try to keep up with things. I do have a large library that I started collecting when I was 16, and I have a print volume library of about 35,000 volumes, and then a digital library, probably 50,000 volumes.
Wow.
And so I do have a large library, but by the way, that doesn't guarantee that I know what I'm talking about, but I have read, I didn't fall off the turnip truck yesterday. I may sound like I did, but I didn't fall off the turnip truck yesterday. And so I research things before I write. I don't just write willy-nilly and put out crazy, goofy stuff. And people who've interacted with my works know that is true, including my Calvinist friends who don't agree with my critique of Calvinism, but they recognize that I have approached it scholarly and non-polemically. I'm not a fighter, try to, fight with everybody. I'm firm, but so are they. They're firm in their views. I'm firm in mine.
Bruce Ware, very well-known Calvinist there at Southern Seminary, endorsed your book as well and talked about your work. And
my very first work, Whosoever Will, and my chapter in there on limited atonement at Evangelical Theological Society that year that book came out. Bruce Ware delivered a paper. He held that book up and he said, David Allen's chapter in this book on limited atonement and its problems, I agree with every word of it. Yeah. And he told me he said that. Now, others were in there. I was not in there. I was there at ETS, but I wasn't in his presentation. But I had dozens of people tell me he said it, but he told me he said it. We talked at the airport on our way out, where, of course, for those of you who are wondering, Ware is a Calvinist who affirms unlimited atonement. He rejects limited atonement, as do many Calvinists, both historically and present. But he was kind enough to endorse that book publicly, holding it up in front of an audience.
Wow. And that's the kind of thing that you get from those. I think you were intellectually honest about those who even they may disagree with over certain subjects. I know that your book that I wrote, the second chapter in the the book that you and Lemke edited.
Yes, Calvinism, a biblical and theological critique. Yeah.
You also had a lot of, Calvinists contribute and a part of that book as well, just demonstrating that you're willing to walk across the aisles, work across the aisle, so to speak, theologically, and talk to people who disagree with you and even have them contribute to the works that you do, which I think is very valuable for us being able to have these kinds of discussions in a godly manner, and helps us to push further to be deeper and to get better at what we're doing.
Absolutely.
Tell our audience anything else that you're working on. I know you've already mentioned your next year very likely coming out with a second portion of this, really getting into the theological implications of your findings, or any other work that maybe you're working on currently.
Well, thank you for asking. I'm working on 3 different books right now. The first one is a revision of my Hebrews commentary in the New American Commentary series. As you know, there's a new series being published by Broadman Holman, and that is called the Christian Standard Bible, Christian Standard Commentary Series, the CSC. And some of us who wrote in the original NAC were asked to revise our works for this series. And so my commentary on Hebrews in the NAC I've just finished the revision, added about 130 pages to it, manuscript, looking at what's been written on Romans since 2010, which is when my original commentary came out. And this commentary will come out. It may not make it by the end of this calendar year, but it'll probably be certainly no later than the spring of 2026. It will be approximately 800 pages in length, and it will be a commentary on the book of Hebrews. It will be coming out. That's number one. Number two, I'm working on a revision of my book, Preaching Tools. I wrote a book that was published in 2014 and then a second edition in 2016 called Preaching Tools. And the subtitle is an annotated bibliography of commentaries and preaching resources for expository preaching. It's a range from Genesis to Revelation, and it's a commentary and resource survey that's annotated. And so that I'm in the process of revising. It's a book that's about 170 pages long right now. It's probably going to be closer to 270 when I do the revision, in order to add in works that have come since 2016 that are available. And I'm excited about that. This will be a huge help to pastors and preachers and Bible study teachers and so forth. That's a second volume I'm working on. And then number 3, I'm working on a follow-up, kind of a second or volume 2, so to speak, of the book To the Jew First, 2-part Romans, a structural game changer, ? Remember, we're not being dogmatic. And this part 2 will kind of cover, 2-part Romans, a theological game changer ? And in that,
we'll have to have you back to talk through some of those concepts, because I wanted to go there several times. I thought, no, let's save that for the next conversation, because in
that volume we'll talk about a number of things. One of which is supersessionism, the idea that Romans teaches supersessionism, that the church replaces Israel. That's a very common viewpoint held by many Reformed, not only them, but many do hold that viewpoint. So I will show that Romans actually teaches just the opposite, doesn't Romans 9 through 11, and that understanding what Paul says and to whom in Romans helps us to get a bigger handle on that concept. So that'll be a part of it. The concept, obviously, unconditional election will fall under my knife, as will reprobation. And some other issues. Now, my Calvinist friends will be relieved to hear that I will firmly and strongly affirm that Romans clearly affirms the eternal security of the believer. And so my Arminian friends will not be happy about that, because I make a very clear case. I think Scripture is clear, and I think Romans is clear that the eternal security of the believer is foundational for Paul's own theology and for his theology in Romans as developed. And so my Reformed friends will be very happy on that front. So there'll be a number of these kinds of things that we'll say, okay, what can we say? What are the theological implications of what's happening in the book of Romans?
Yeah. Well, thank you for giving us kind of an update on your future things that are coming down the pike. And again, we'll have you back on when that second book comes out, because I know there's a lot of questions that'll come with that. In fact, we had some questions come through, some super chats. Joel says he's not a Calvinist, but could 1 Corinthians 3:7 mean that God must do something before we believe? Would love your insight, the possibility, interpretation I see. Well, one, we do believe God must do something before we believe. Yeah. God must reveal. He's the one who brings conviction. The Holy Spirit brings conviction to the world. He sent Jesus. He inspired the text. I mean, he did a lot of things before we believe. We're responders. We're responding to him. And so I know 1 Corinthians 3:7, I think that's when it talks about Paul waters, Apollos, but God's the one who causes the growth, if I'm remembering off the top of my head. We all believe God causes the growth. It's just the concept and idea of him effectually causing people to believe or not.
Right.
We don't believe that he effectually causes certain people to believe and leaves the rest as decreed unable to believe from birth. That's where we would disagree. So hopefully, Joel, that addresses your issue there. Joel, also, thank you again for another super chat. He says, thankful for your work answering questions. I live near a Reformed hotspot and have something many people I can ask about my disagreements with them, but no one to talk to see the things that I might lean Calvinist. Thanks for all you do. And again, thank you, Joel, for your
that.
Very generous super chats. Thank you for that. And so we could talk forever, Dr. Allen. We've already gone over our hour mark, well over our hour mark. And again, I want to go ahead and put out that public invitation for when you release your next book on this, because I want to follow up, I think, with this. And I know a lot of our listeners will want to follow up. If you have not got the book yet, there's a link in the show notes that you can go purchase that right now and get a hold of it. And that way you're read up and ready to go to the second volume when it comes out, and we can have a further conversation about that. But again, Dr. Allen, thank you so much for your willingness to come on. I really appreciate it.
Well, my pleasure. And may I mention this to your audience as well? They'll find this interesting in light of the fact that you and I recently were at Salem Heights Church, you preaching the last Sunday of January and I preaching last Sunday on Romans 9. And I think your viewers and listeners will be happy or be excited to know that we're going to be transcribing those sermons, yours and mine, and the 90-minute Q&A section that you had on your Sunday evening and that I had later. And we're going to transcribe all of that and put that together into a book and make it available on Amazon. And so hopefully, perhaps as early as this summer, we can get all that done and get that book out, jointly authored by Dr. Flowers and Dr. Allen. And so you can watch for that as well.
I just like having my name on the same cover of a book that you are on, Dr. Allen. That's my dream. And then also, we both work at Trinity. Many people may not be aware of that. I know you're an adjunct with Trinity Seminary, and I'm a professor of theology with Trinity. And so if you're looking for a higher theological education, I'd be remiss not to mention Trinity Seminary. If you're looking for a way to get an education, consider Trinity. Also, remember, this is a listener-supported ministry, and so we appreciate those who give on a regular basis. Thank you for those that send in super chats and those who support what we're doing. Help us get the word out by liking and sharing these videos. Tell more people about this. Recommend Dr. Allen's work to folks. The Calvinists are really good about recommending their scholars and the books of their scholars to everyone. And I think we as provisionists need to do better at recommending the scholars that are writing so much about God's love and provision for all people. And Dr. David Allen is doing a great job at that, and I appreciate his work. God bless you, brother. Really appreciate you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Flowers. Been a pleasure to be with you today.
Go now, share Christ, and show love. God bless.